I'm Emily Burns, the director of the Charles M. Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West here in the School of Visual Art at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to this wonderful book talk. I'll begin with our university's land acknowledgement. Long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which the university now resides was the traditional home of the Haznai Caddo Nation and the Kirikiris, Wichita, and affiliated tribes. We acknowledge this territory once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. The University of Oklahoma recognizes the historical connection our university has with its Indigenous community. We acknowledge, honor, and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. This acknowledgement is aligned with our university's core value of creating a diverse and inclusive community. It is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our entire OU community. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. I am delighted to welcome my colleague, Dr. Carolin Görgen, who is an associate professor of American Studies at the Sorbonne Université in Paris. I'll tell you a bit about Görgen's career trajectory. After studying American Studies and art history at Radboud in the Netherlands, and then also in the United States and France, Dr. Görgen obtained her PhD from the University of Paris Diderot and the École du Louvre in 2018. Her research focuses on the photographic history of California and the American West, and has been supported by important grants from the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Huntington Library, Yale's Beinecke Library, and the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, to name a few. We are gathering today to celebrate Dr. Görgen's book, The California Camera Club: Collective Visions in the Making of the American West, published in October 2025 by the University of Oklahoma Press. And this book is number 40 in the Charles M. Russell series in the study of the photography and art of the American West, which is a series that my predecessor, Byron Price, began in 2007 with the catalog Raisonné for Charles Russell, in which I've been delighted to engage a role as series editor. There was great serendipity in the timing of my arrival at OU and Dr. Görgen's timing in working on a book version of her dissertation project, which focused on the California Camera Club. And it's been a delight to work with Dr. Görgen at every stage of this project, the first that I've helped to acquire for OU Press and for the Russell series, which analyzes the entwinements between amateur and professional photographic practices and the development of California identity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, about which you will soon hear more. I also wanted to make space to highlight Carolin's dedication of her book to a colleague in Paris, François Brunet, one of the advisors of Dr. Görgen's dissertation, who died far too young. He was a giant in the field of American photography history and American studies. And he was also someone who was incredibly influential in my own projects about American art in Paris. Someone who welcomed me from like my youngest days, trudging around Paris archives to work on my dissertation project. And he's someone who's deeply missed by both of us. Just to update you on Dr. Görgen's work beyond this project, she recently received an incredibly competitive grant from the Institut Universitaire de France, the IUF, to support her research initiatives for the next 5 years, giving her time to focus on research and to support research trajectories. And I'm already peppering her with questions about this project, which I'm hoping will also find a home in the series, because as you'll see, it will focus on ecology in the American West through photography, thinking about petroleum and oil and photographic practices in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So Dr. Görgen is someone someone to keep an eye on for the project that we're going to be focused on today. And she's also happy to sign copies for those of you who have them with you. And then looking ahead to a really illustrious career. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Görgen.
Wow. Thank you so much, Emily, for this kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out for this lecture. It's really a pleasure to be speaking at the University of Oklahoma, which has made this project in its book form possible in the first place. Emily, you've been such a generous interlocutor over the past decade, and I'm so grateful that we're finally back together after so many transatlantic emails and Zoom calls. And I'm, as Emily said, I am especially thankful that she reached out to me while I was working on my book proposal back in 2022, when I was very anxious about where to submit this manuscript about this obscure camera club. You understood the project right from the start, and along with the wonderful folks at the University of Oklahoma Press, Andrew Berzanskis, Anthony Roberts, and Riley Hines, you made the publication of this book possible. And it's more than I could have ever dreamed of seeing this book. And I assume members of the California Camera Club, if they were around today, they would feel the same. So yes, the CCC, the California Camera Club, this was the largest photo organization of its kind in the United States in 1900, but it is hardly remembered by anyone. And tonight I'd like to tell you a bit more about the rise and fall of this club and how we can make sense of the dispersed archive of such a vast community more than a century later. So you might ask why a scholar from the Sorbonne would want to dig up the history of an obscure photo collective of the early 1900s in the first place. Well, it all started in Paris in 2013 at the Université Paris Diderot, where I did my master's in American Studies. And as part of a photo history seminar with said professor, Francois Brunet, the assignment was to write a paper on an event that connects the history of photography to American history. And the event that I picked was the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, which was arguably the most photographed event of the early 20th century. The earthquake coincided with the mass commercialization of Kodak cameras, notably the $1 Brownie camera, and historians have suggested that by 1906, by the time that the earthquake struck, about 1 in 3 Americans could have owned such a handheld camera. And the archival wealth across California really confirms this impression. The digital earthquake collection, which was launched on the centennial of the earthquake in 2006, includes more than 10,000 photographs. And that is just a slice of the materials gathered from a few California institutions. Dozens of other regional collections in public libraries and historical societies really multiply this number. And it is through this event, through the earthquake and fire, that I became interested in amateur photography. And when I say amateur photography, I don't just mean individuals sort of taking snapshots with their Kodaks, but what I mean are really collective practices of photography in organized clubs, camera clubs that were widespread in North America, in Europe, but really across the globe in this period. So amid the mass of materials that I found, let's see if I can, this doesn't want, oh, yes, okay, thank you, thanks. Amid the mass of materials, I found the magazine Camera Craft, which was edited by members of the California Camera Club, again, then the largest photo organization in the US. As you can see from the cover of this issue, the headquarters of the California Camera Club on Market Street were entirely destroyed in April of 1906, but the organization itself survived the catastrophe because the club had in fact been rooted in the state for decades. Between the 1880s and the 1920s and beyond, Camera Club members organized hundreds of excursions and exhibitions. They hosted 4 international photo salons. They participated in 2 World's Fairs. They issued 2 journals over the course of half a century, and they survived 1 earthquake. And the club started in San Francisco, but it would build a network that really spanned the entire West Coast, up to the Pacific Northwest and down to the Southwest. It cultivated close ties to Western artists, politicians, investors, and environmentalists. So for an organization like the California Camera Club, which had more than 400 members, women and men, I think that it is necessary to shift the focus towards the regional conditions that inspired this kind of photo practice. So there are a few questions that I ask in the book with regard to these materials. Emily, would you mind? Thank you. What did it mean to be a California Camera Club member at a time when photography became widely accessible? And in turn, how was the image of California, with its history very much in the making, how was this image shaped by this growing community of photographers? And finally, then, how did these collective practices influence Western American photography in the long run? And so before diving into the club's chronology, I want to insist on just how understudied the period of the turn of the century still is in American photography, both regarding camera clubs and the American West. So research on camera clubs tends to remain dominated by the elitist New York Photo Secession, which was established by Alfred Stieglitz in 1902. Its members, quite successfully really, were on a quest to establish photography amid the fine arts. And it is through this fine art lens that camera clubs have been almost exclusively studied. The Photo Secession has generated new research since the 1970s, and it still seems as though the Stieglitz Circle remains the only club that is worthy, if you will, of scholarly consideration. Although, at the same time as the Photo Secession was active in the early 1900s, there were more than 100 camera clubs active across the United States. So in my book, I am inspired by research from Europe as well, where in the last decade, especially thanks to books by Elizabeth Edwards and Christian Joschke, historians have become interested in the social, political, and cultural aspects of amateur photography. So in other words, they have removed these fine art labels and instead explored camera clubs as really socio-political organizations that are rooted both in a regional and in a rising national environment around 1900s. Both of these scholars have thought of camera clubs as imagined communities. This is a term derived from Benedict Anderson. And looking at the extreme diversity of camera club materials and the decades-long existence of the California Camera Club, I realized that I too needed to remove some of these formal labels, such as photo as art or pictorialism, and instead really look at the regional conditions that inspired California Camera Club practice. And this brings me to my second point, the traditional history of photography in the American West. It remains to this day a succession of master photographers, from Watkins to Weston, as one curator put it a few years ago. For the past half century, there have been numerous exhibits, catalogs, biographies on these so-called photographers of genius, mostly focusing on the same set of figures, that is Carlton Watkins, Ansel Adams, and Edward Weston, all men, all Euro-Americans, and more often than not, all framed as loners who are venturing out into nature. But As archives across the region show, photography in the American West was only very rarely a lone undertaking. And the pristine print that we're so used to from the museum wall is only a very small fraction of a much broader range of photo objects that were made out west. So the vast majority of photographic objects in my book, that is prints, thank you, that is prints, periodicals, lantern slides, albums, catalogs, correspondence, they're not housed in fine art museums. Instead, they're located in more locally rooted institutions like the Bancroft Library on the UC Berkeley campus, the California Historical Society, or the LA Public Library. And these institutions all predate the founding of Californian museums, and they demonstrate the degree to which the club's practice was interwoven with the history of the state and the history of the region and city. So the club's roots in this region are not just expressed in photos of place, but really, if you look at the backs of their prints, you will find numerous labels from other local camera clubs where those photographs would be shown. They would express their local views in lantern slides, like the one that's on the cover of the book that's over there on the right. And these images really existed on a variety of material supports. So photography from the California Camera Club's point of view is so much more than just a photographic print. So from the time that California became a state in 1850 during the gold rush, the medium was present. Marnie Sandweiss famously argued that photography in the American West came of age together. By the 1880s, more than 1,500 men and women were working in the Californian photo industry, and this vast image market catered to a local audience that desired to imagine itself as new Western settlers. But at the same time, this massive image production also catered to national audiences that were thirsting for images of the West. And as the railroad expanded across the American West, photography became the most valuable tool to promote the nation's westernmost regions. Near the close of the century then, photographic technologies became accessible to the larger publics. Dry plates would replace the very cumbersome wet collodion process of the 19th century, and photographs could be taken with greater ease, especially outdoors, since the plates did not require immediate developing. And once Eastman Kodak entered the market with flexible film, the company transformed photography from a profession into a social practice. And as photography became more affordable and people had more leisure time on their hands, they would gather to take photographs, to share their expertise, and to improve techniques. By 1882, the first camera club was formed in Boston, and San Francisco came in second in 1883 with the so-called Pacific Coast Amateur Photographic Association, the PCAPA. This is the forerunner of the California Camera Club. The PCAPA was founded in 1883, again, the second camera club of its kind in the US. And for years, it would remain the only club west of the Mississippi. And its members, as you can see up on screen here, organized the first photo exhibitions in San Francisco in the 1880s. So this was a strictly non-commercial photographer organization, this PCAPA of the 1880s, and they could only survive a few years because in San Francisco and in California writ large, the booster climate very much mobilized artists for promoting the West, for Euro-American settlement. At its peak, this organization included some 70 gentlemen members. They were attorneys, physicists, or real estate dealers, and many of them were descendants of gold rush immigrants. They celebrated California as a land of milk and honey. This is a quote from a discourse at one of their meetings. And they had clear ties to California's promotional booster scene. As such, the PCAPA, so this first camera club, struggled to maintain a non-commercial outlook. This all came to a clash in 1890 when one of the members, George Read, overstepped the line and sold a print of the Golden Gate. George Read had taken a photograph of the Golden Gate, and he was dismissed from the group because he had sold a print. In reaction to his exclusion, then, George Read went on to found the California Camera Club, with ranks that were open to professional photographers as well as women. And Read would be joined by a number of notable professionals from San Francisco. This would include Howard Tibbetts, who was the official photographer of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and local professional Oscar V. Lang, who is pictured here on the left, who had had a business in San Francisco, photo business, since the 1880s. So this embrace of the city's photo scene was unprecedented. Read and his co-founders of the California Camera Club recognized and realized that practicing photography in San Francisco included both women and men. It included amateurs and professionals, hobbyists, and local artists. And the inclusive stance adopted by the California Camera Club reflects how photography was embedded in the region. The model of the gentleman amateur was impractical, especially in California, where women represented more than 10% of the photo industry's workforce, and many others practiced photography as a hobby. Among the many clubs that were springing up across the United States around the turn of the century, all struggled to include women, and overall female membership reached no more than 7%. In California, however, the California Camera Club's female membership was twice as high, that is more than 14%, between 14 and 15%. And so this number does reflect the very active contribution of women to Western photography and their attraction to the outdoors, as you can see here. But this also needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, because women, mostly white women in those clubs, would not take up leadership positions for many more decades. Like many clubs in the United States in the early 1900s, the California Camera Club consisted of a prosperous white middle class. Keeping in mind that in San Francisco, this meant that its members belonged to the city's vast immigrant population. In the club, many were of Irish, Italian, or German origin. And like many other artistic institutions in San Francisco, the club did, with very few exceptions, not include Chinese, Mexican, or African American members. There is one notable exception, however, and that is Mary Tape. She's pictured right there on the right in this family photograph. Mary Tape joined the California Camera Club in the early 1890s, and she made lantern slides of the California landscape. These are documents that I have tried to recover through her descendants, but they aren't available for reproduction in the book, unfortunately. And I'm happy to talk about Mary Tape's career as a photographer and as an influential San Francisco woman a little bit later. But given this very exclusive stance, racially and ethnically speaking, of the California Camera Club, this idea of photography as an extremely democratic practice around 1900 can be criticized. By 1900, as photographers were more actively striving for recognition amid the fine arts, many clubs organized exhibitions, or so-called salons. These were modeled very remotely on the exhibitions at the Parisian fine art academies. And in San Francisco, these salons were held at the Mark Hopkins Institute, which is pictured right here. This was the mansion of a former railroad manager of the Transcontinental Railroad, Mark Hopkins. And for club members, exhibiting their work at the Mark Hopkins Institute corresponded to their own portrayal as Western pioneers. The club's magazine called on readers to submit so-called characteristic Western pictures to these shows. And during these salons, it was particularly Western women who would build meaningful connections. This is a photograph by Lily White. She was a member of the Oregon Camera Club, so further up north, and she showed her work in San Francisco. Lily White produced prints while traveling on the Columbia River on a houseboat where she lived with her friend, Sarah Ladd, and both of these women had built a darkroom on this boat where they developed their own photographs. So for women in these more remote regions of the West Coast, like Oregon, showing their photographs in San Francisco at the salons was an extremely meaningful opportunity to build connections with photographers in the larger cities of the American West. The same can also be said for photographers down south in Los Angeles. The photographer Harai Forbes, a woman, was also very much inspired by the San Francisco salons, so much so that she decided to organize her own salon in Los Angeles by 1902. And so all of this came to an abrupt stop in the early morning hours of April 18th, 1906. Shortly after 5 a.m., there was a ripple of lateral movements in the San Andreas Fault, which runs some 1,200 kilometers across the state of California. San Francisco, in other words, was struck by an earthquake, and the magnitude of that earthquake is estimated today at approximately 7.9 on the Richter scale. By 5:30 that same morning, more than 50 fires had broken out across the city due to broken gas pipes. These fires turned into a literal firestorm that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. 75% of the city were destroyed, and more than half of the population, that is 250,000 people, lost their homes. It was the fire that caused the most considerable damage, and it could have been prevented had water supply been functional in San Francisco and firefighting measures correctly employed. The death toll of the earthquake and fire was first massively downplayed, and it is estimated today at around 5,000. We still don't have official numbers. There will never be official numbers. And this death toll, of course, included a significant number of Chinese residents, the city's largest minority, whose deaths were never officially recorded. And so, as you can imagine, the earthquake marks a rupture in the club's history. It represented a significant challenge in making sense of the scattered archives of the Camera Club. Shortly after the tremor, the editor of Camera Craft actually was the last to see the club rooms. He described in the magazine a few months later how he went up the stairs in the Academy of Sciences building on Market Street, and he described a strong smell of gas in the club rooms, and he had just enough time to secure a small camera before leaving the building, and then it burned down. Across the city, photographers would watch their collections burn. One was witnessing the dynamiting of his home. Another recounted the loss of more than 2,000 negatives. The region's older photographers, like Carlton Watkins, who is pictured here being escorted out of his home with the cane here. He was half blind at that point. Those older photographers also suffered major losses. Actually, some of Watkins's collections was supposed to be moved to a safer location only a few days later, but it all vanished in the fire. One of the most emblematic photographs of the earthquake and fire was made by the German-born club photographer Arnold Gente, this street scene of people looking down a street in San Francisco, watching the approaching fire. So Gente captures this very diverse group of San Franciscans, African Americans, Asians, Euro-Americans, witnessing the event together. Such depictions were extremely rare. They would be very rapidly replaced by a tale of communal harmony in which San Francisco's white population was depicted as benevolent, while its Chinese residents were gradually vanishing or depicted as looters if they were looking for their belongings amid the ruins. Since Chinatown burned down entirely, which was a deliberate decision, and refugee camps were segregated, the Chinese community was essentially left to its own devices, and the photographic record entirely obscured their experiences. We do not have photographic records of Chinatown residents or photographers, even though there were many photo studios in that neighborhood. City officials would then play on the myth of San Francisco as a phoenix rising from the ashes due to the large number of fire in the city's history. The phoenix is also in the city's seal. And city officials would do so again after April 1906. The project of building a new San Francisco was spearheaded by local politicians and entrepreneurs, and they rejected nostalgic depictions of ruins like the ones by Louis Stellman, which were made in the aftermath of the fire and later on published in this very beautiful coffee table book, Vanished Ruin Era, that was published a few years later. Investors did not like these nostalgic depictions of a California Mediterranean in ruins. Instead, they wanted to document the construction of a new American city ready for the 20th century. And there was another club photographer who catered to exactly that need. You see this in the photograph on the right. This was made by Edward Sewell. Edward Sewell was a longstanding California Camera Club member, and he compiled 4 albums over the course of 4 years, meticulously documenting the rebuilding of the city. And these albums were later on donated to former Mayor James Phelan. So every April between 1906 and 1909, Sewell documented the rebuilding of the city. And on screen here, we see the commercial building, the building that I highlighted there in orange. On the roof of this building, the club would have its own penthouse on the upper floor. And this new location then was the new headquarters for the California Camera Club. And it really cemented the club's position as the foremost photo organization in the city. To revive their practice after the traumatic experience of the earthquake and fire, and to fill the club archives once again, members returned to Yosemite. The photographer's documentation of San Francisco in ruins is a very rare urban excursion in a corpus that is otherwise really marked by landscape photography. From the 1890s, the club organized annual outings to Yosemite, and one member, Oscar Mara, described the outing frenzy as follows. Let's see. I am here in... The one before. Thank you. I am here in Yosemite with a number of Camera Club members, and the click of the shutter is heard in all parts of the valley at all times of the day. And this assessment of California's most popular photography terrain, Yosemite, is confirmed in period views. They show amateur photographers, camera at hand, at the park's most emblematic sites. And in the period, Eastman Kodak expanded its market to these outdoorsy amateur photographers. By 1901, the ads for Eastman Kodak would declare that the Kodak is to other cameras as the redwoods of California are to ordinary trees. So Kodak would really build on this connection between the native Californian trees and the photographic device, both becoming these powerful instruments. And the trees stand in this seemingly untouched setting, and they offer the perfect playground for photographers who merely needed to grab train tickets and cameras. And within the California Camera Club, these calls very much resonated. For decades, California Camera Club members would bring their equipment to the valley and pose together, portraying themselves as preservationists, like their friends of the Sierra Club, and as an organization dedicated to the Californian environment. It was the Southern Pacific which offered special fairs for club members and space for reproductions of their photographs in Sunset Magazine, which was the railroad's official magazine. An outing would typically consist of a 2-week trip through the valley. Transportation, accommodation, and meals included. Participants had to anticipate a very significant budget. And to attract more members to annual excursions, the offer included the ride on a special car that was adorned with the California Camera Club banner that you can see on the right and that they would later use for their collective photos and portraits at Yosemite. At Yosemite, then, the photographers would follow a packaged excursion guide with hikes to scenic vistas, fireside chats, camping, and games. And these seemingly banal activities were documented in Sunset, where they helped normalize territorial acquisition. And in this, the California Camera Club was no different from its sister organization, the Sierra Club, which was California's first environmental organization. So in the book, I was very much inspired by recent research in the environmental humanities, and I trace some of the ecological footprint of this kind of collective photography. And photographers very much relied on the railroad in all of their endeavors. Despite their claims of being nature enthusiasts, they directly benefited from the massive territorial expansion of the railroad. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 and expanded across the West, photographers would assist the rise to power of this enterprise. And it's not just Carlton Watkins who held ties with the railroad famously. It was also these now unknown California Camera Club members who prominently visualized the imperial ideas of the railroad. Members were paid by the railroad to circulate visions and fantasies about California, and these visions and fantasies omitted the devastation of land and the displacement of indigenous peoples under the banner of progress. So just as a reminder, since this does not so much appear in the photographic record of the California Camera Club, for the railroad to cut through Western lands, trees would be chopped, mountains and rocks detonated, tunnels were drilled, tracks were laid, snow plows were pushed. The railroads exploited a mainly Chinese workforce and colonized indigenous lands. And this railroad colonialism functioned through imported labor and through militarized expansion, and it was normalized in beautiful images later on. The California Camera Club accompanied the railroad thus, and it praised the railroad for its resource extraction. Members documented the felling of big trees for the lumber industry, which provided raw materials for tracks and railroad cars. And although the big trees were seen as these symbols of national grandeur, think back to the Kodak ad that I showed before or the cover of Sunset magazine, the big trees of California were national icons. At the same time, the act of felling them, as you can see pictured here on the right, provided or promised to a certain extent mastery over the territory and access to even more raw materials. During their collective trips, members not just produced prints and negatives, but also later on repurposed their materials for lantern slides, like the one that's on the cover on the book. Once a month at San Francisco's Metropolitan Temple, these slides were projected onto a large screen, accompanied by music and anecdotes that entertained and instructed the local public. So between the 1900s and the 1920s, these lectures were attended every month by hundreds of people. The local newspapers regularly reported on these lantern slide entertainments and how popular they were. And these lectures, especially the ones about Yosemite, were also a significant tool to perpetuate these settler colonial visions of places like Yosemite, attempting to erase the valley's indigenous past and present, and presenting the club's vision of the landscape as a supposedly virgin land that was worth protecting. So it is exactly this kind of outdoor practice that the California Camera Club relied on that would also inspire later practitioners, including Ansel Adams, the master photographer of the American West, with whom probably everyone in this room is familiar. Before becoming the widely praised artist that Adams is today, he started out with the California Camera Club. Adams was born in 1902. And he first saw works that were made by club members at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, when he was just 13 years old. And on the right, you actually have a photograph taken by Adams at age 13 on the grounds of the Panama Pacific International Exposition. At the occasion of this World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, San Francisco celebrated the rebuilding of the city in less than 10 years after the earthquake and fire. And of course, it also celebrated the recent construction of the Panama Canal. The fair was, to a certain extent, also the last hooray of the first generation of the California Camera Club. The club was then led by a professional photographer couple, Josephine and Edward Kemp, who had documented the construction of the Panama Canal and lectured widely for years on the advantages of the canal for an American empire. At the World's Fair, there was a display of Californian photography, which included older members of the California Camera Club, but also younger aspiring photographers, such as Imogen Cunningham and Edward Weston. And the following years, up until the 1920s and 1930s, the club headquarters in San Francisco remained a key venue for these aspiring artists. Numerous well-known photographers started out with solo shows at the California Camera Club, including Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange, the Depression-era photographer, came to San Francisco from New York, where she had been an assistant of Arnold Gente, the earthquake photographer. And she arrived in San Francisco at a young age, and she regularly used the club's dark rooms in the 1920s. In her later life, Dorothea Lange recounted that she had met many wonderful people at the California Camera Club. So you might ask here, why has the California Camera Club disappeared from photo history? Of course, there's the earthquake, the dispersed and incomplete archival records, the hundreds of objects that are dispersed across collections in the American West. That is one reason. But another reason that has to do with the disappearance of the California Camera Club is also the ways in which photo history has been written, especially in the United States. So striving to establish photography amid the fine arts, Alfred Stieglitz, who I mentioned at the beginning, but especially Ansel Adams, from the 1930s onwards, deliberately excluded camera clubs from the emerging photo departments at local museums. So it's very common now to see photographs exhibited in fine art museums, but this was a very gradual development over the first few decades of the 20th century. And in the interest of the fine arts and a fine art narrative of photography, camera club works were discarded as amateurish. They did not fit the art historical canon of the medium and these photographers of genius. Ansel Adams himself very skillfully established himself as California's master photographers, as someone who supposedly followed directly in the footsteps of 19th century pioneers. In his later life, time and again, he would tell historians that when he visited the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, again, as a 13-year-old, he found that the California Camera Club show was dreadful. He also referred to California Camera Club members as, quote, these damn camera club people with hideous taste. What bothered Ansel Adams so much? Well, it's likely that it was the far-reaching network of the camera club and the expertise that the club had built for decades, long before he was born. But he was likely also bothered by the messiness of the organization. The California Camera Club had more than 400 members at its climax. It included many an ordinary amateur who simply wanted to take some good snaps at the beach or of their cats. There are actually plenty of cat photographs in Camera Craft if you're interested. And so the messiness of camera clubs makes it so that many questions remain unanswered. I cannot tell you who took the photograph on the cover of the book, nor can I identify the sitters. I have tried. There are no official club archives, there are only very few membership lists, and there is no mention of when the organization officially disbanded. It continued for decades, up until the 1960s and 70s, really. And I think this is what also makes the beauty of it. Camera clubs very much complicate the notion of individual authorship. Photographic objects, like the ones made by the Camera Club, were made by networks of practitioners and suppliers. They're embedded in far-reaching production chains, and they were circulated far beyond our reach. And so I'm very glad that the California Camera Club has finally found a home at the University of Oklahoma Press in a series that is dedicated to the regional arts of the American West. I think that this is where the club belongs, in the hopes of providing smaller and, yes, messier perspectives on the epic history of the American West. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Where did the press photographers fit into this funnel?
The press photographers, that's an interesting question. Well, in the early 1900s, late 19th century, early 20th century, most of the newspapers would rely on the works of some of the city's professional photographers, and those were, to a certain extent, members of the California Camera Club. Not all of them, but in this first generation, yes, there is the strong collaboration with amateurs and professionals, and some of the more well-established professionals were happy to join the ranks of the California Camera Club. But this is really only the case for the first generation. In later years, the press photographers didn't really care about joining camera clubs. Yes.
I really appreciate your critical reappraisal of American photo history. And I've come to the conclusion that what's being taught in all the photo history courses from the standard section of Newell is seriously flawed.
Yes, yes.
And it's, from what I've read, has been more than just having evidence against the camera.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This is just
he was working on revising the history, particularly of other schools of California photography.
Mm-hmm.
That he personally didn't like.
Yeah, yeah.
In order to savage the reputation
Yes.
of some people
Yes.
and promote his own. So I think this is very much needed. Way of looking at the history, which all photographers, as they do academics, are taught. They're all going through this.
Mm-hmm.
My technical question, though, is I'm assuming that despite the popularity of the Brownie and Kodak film process, that the people you're talking about in this camera class, by and large, are using larger format equipment, and that it also implied that they had to be proficient in developing.
Yes, yes.
That there was a vast popularization level, but I think that's in a way separate from the images that many of these people are putting out.
Yes, yes. Mm-mm. No, I agree. So the California Camera Club considered itself an extremely inclusive organization when you're thinking of in the terms of the practice of photography. So yes, there were plenty, especially in the later decades of the club in the 20s and 30s, who would just come in with their brownies and their on-the-go Kodak cameras. But in the first few years, yes, many were extremely skilled photographers who mastered also the older processes of photography. And this was an organization that had a certain awareness also of the medium's history. So for example, in the early 1900s, they would bring in some of San Francisco's old daguerreotypists, and they would have demonstration nights at the California Camera Club to understand how daguerreotypes were made, which were by the 1900s, of course, already an outdated process. So yes, it was, but I think it was in terms of technique, it was an extremely eclectic group, just like with so many other of their practices. Yeah.
Where's your judgment as to the quality?
The quality?
The
The quality of the images, okay. I think it's pretty mediocre. what you see reproduced in camera craft is, yeah, those are productions that by and large we would identify as amateurish today. I'm not really interested in the aesthetic value of these photographs or their market value for that matter. I'm much more interested in how those photographs operated. Why was it so important for dozens of members of the California Camera Club to go out to Yosemite every summer, to spend 2 weeks there together, and to produce all of those images that they had to repurpose, that they had to circulate, that they had to show, like this one way or another, to people not just across the city, but really across the country in these lantern slide lectures. So I'm not that interested in whether these were artistically accomplished photographers. I'm more interested in what the practices did and where they wanted those photographs to be seen.
I hope you have found someone who should join you.
Yes, I have. And also to your point about the Newhall history of photography, that's a very important point. And around the same time when Bowman Newhall was writing his history of photography in the 1930s, when photography's history was becoming sort of institutionalized, there was another local historian, Robert Taft, who also wrote a history of photography, a social history of photography. He corresponded with Bowman Newhall for a while, and he, in his book, very much talked about the social practices of photography historically from the 19th century onwards up until his present, which was the 1930s. And he, interestingly enough, made a point about the value of historical societies and public libraries that preserve photographs. The professor we mentioned at the beginning, Francois Brunet, actually wrote an article about this correspondence. It's in English, it's not in French. The Bowman Newhall, Robert Taft connection. It's really fascinating. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I assume that when the earthquake and fires happened, that everything within their club headquarters was destroyed.
Yes.
And so you have some names of people that were in the club.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know if they have ancestors that things might have been passed along to,
Mm-hmm.
or even verbal stories passed along to, that where those people could speak with them,
Mm-hmm.
historical continuation of the story?
Yes, that's a very important question. I talked to a few ancestors, descendants rather, of Camera Club members who had their family members' photographs already transferred to local archives, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area. This was more than 10 years ago. What those descendants knew was that their grandfathers, for most of those cases, were accomplished photographers. They didn't really know much about Camera Club membership, which is also interesting. And given the fact that I was able to write this book despite the earthquake means that, in fact, a lot of the materials survived. It's just a question of where to find them. I used Camera Craft, the magazine, which started in 1900. It continued up until 1942. And this is really a gold mine for anything related to the California Camera Club, because it's in Camera Craft that you will find reports about the meetings of the Camera Club, about who had an exhibition there, who organized the outings, and so on and so forth. And I would go into the archives in the Bay Area and elsewhere in California with this list of names from Camera Craft, and I'd look up their names individually to see if there was anything related to the Camera Club. And there was a lot. But if you look only for California Camera Club, there's really not much that comes up. It's the individual, after all, that makes the club.
Names of other people from those ancestors that had been in the club?
No. Usually what they remembered was photography, but not necessarily any club activity, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, and it's also interesting that I noticed that California has not a very good quality of firefighting or resources since 1906.
Yes. No, it's true. Oh, absolutely. That it's it's a good point, especially when we're talking about the earthquake risk, because they were so frenetic in their rebuilding of San Francisco after 1906 that the next time that a major earthquake hit the Bay Area in 1989, they were facing some of the same problems that they had faced in the early 1900s because rebuilding hadn't been done properly. It was
Well, it
all
stretches all the way to LA.
it does now. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to ask you, has the name Jessie Tarbox Beals, woman photographer, ever popped up?
Yes.
In your research?
Yes. Jessie Beals. Yes. There are some of her works at the Bancroft Library, but I was never able to connect her.
She's an interesting lady. She photographed a lot of the Chicago.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But she was, as I've kind of been through my reading, quite a pistol. I mean, they said, no, you can't go out there, and she'd go out with like a 50-foot
Of course she would.
And crawl up this ladder to get the best.
Amazing.
In the middle of the street of the parade coming out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she, and she was friends with Muir.
John Muir. John Muir.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So,
Fascinating. I didn't know that. She doesn't appear in the book because there were only very dispersed sources that I was able to find about her, or at least her presence in San Francisco. But thank you.
Yeah,
I'm glad there's more.
there is.
Yes.
Your observation about the number of women photographers in Oklahoma for the territorial period, it also averages just right at a straight up 8% consistently over the last 40 years.
Interesting.
Doing that documentation. It's stayed right there. The other thing is in Oklahoma and a number of adjacent states, right at 1900, a few years before, a couple of states joining us, we had the beginning of professional photography associations associated on the state level. And I find that interesting because of a number of things, in particular with Kodak, where they were bringing in people from Kodak to speak and do training sessions at their meetings. And there's a correlation also with the supply houses. They published periodically, some of them monthly, with huge amounts of information about what was happening with local photographers in a whole variety of states, including what becomes Oklahoma.
That's a very important point, and that's a very similar development that we see in San Francisco. So there are a number of professional photo organizations in San Francisco prior to these amateur groups in the 1860s and 70s. They're relatively short-lived, and by the time that this very first organization emerges, the forerunner of the California Camera Club, this Pacific Coast Amateur Photographic Association, the PCAPA, they, even though they're strictly non-commercial, they get these demonstration nights once a month or every other month where someone from Kodak, the Pacific Coast representative, or someone with that kind of title would come in and demonstrate the latest gadgets you could get. And this is also why, especially in this early period, the professional photographers found it interesting to join camera clubs, because camera clubs were potential markets also for them as suppliers. And you see some, even as you say, in the magazines like Camera Craft, there are announcements and advertisements of professional photographers in the city catering directly to these amateur needs. Yeah.
The local situation, one of the 1890s photographers here, professional studios in Norman, the public library was in that building.
Oh, yes. Meaningful connection. Don't underestimate the public libraries. The cover of the book is from the LA Public Library. Yes.
So you're talking about how this is a very dispersed archive. Like you were just looking at names that you pulled, and do you think it's worthwhile to then go back to these sources that you consulted and advocate for, at least in terms of metadata, adding this label of the California Camera Club to those objects so they can be found again and be reconnected into that dispersed network.
Yes. I've talked to some of the archivists, particularly at the California Historical Society, where there are a lot of Camera Club materials they're currently being moved to Stanford special collections. But I've talked to archivists there, yes, saying that it would be meaningful to have a label added that would make it, easier for future researchers, if anyone's interested in the CCC after this, to look up more. And I'm sure there is more. You have to stop researching at some point, but I am confident that there is just so much more, and not just in local archives, but also just in a garage somewhere in the Bay Area or
A lot
elsewhere.
of stuff that's been found in garages.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could situate this group within other sort of club or, the organization of clubs in this period. This seems to be a period where social clubs and
Yes.
creative clubs are
Yes.
really exploding
Mhm.
in America. So were there drawing clubs? Elks clubs?
Yes. If you were a member of the California Camera Club, it's likely that you were a member of another social organization in the Bay Area in particular. In the first generation that I'm looking at, the 1890s to just about 1915, we see a lot of sort of well-established San Franciscans who are members of the California Camera Club, but will at the same time also be members of the Sierra Club, the first environmental organization also founded in San Francisco, or the Bohemian Club, which is this relatively elitist circle, right? That is meeting in the redwoods north of San Francisco. They have their own photographers to document their meetings, and these are members of the CCC. So there is a lot of overlap. And then once you get to the women photographers, a lot of them would be active in a variety of women's clubs across California that are really springing up. Well, not just across California, but really across the US in this progressive era climate of taking your responsibilities as a good citizen, right? And like preserving the environment is one of the things, or preserving local history. There's a lot of local history organizations that also spring up in these years, and the membership in these different organizations really overlaps and intersects in that period. Yeah. Photography is just one thing. Yeah.
In addition to the social aspect of the club, was there an economic aspect to it that collectively they could acquire equipment for developing, et cetera, or enlarging?
Yes, there's definitely an economic dimension to the club, being a club member and having access also to the club's facilities. I showed you the photograph of the club headquarters that they occupied after the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1909. This was documented in the local newspaper at the time as, a relatively expensive real estate transaction on the part of the California Camera Club. And so this was paid in part by membership dues. And so you needed to have a certain, social standing if you wanted to participate in that club. But then the club itself was also, yes, making money through its excursions, making money through its membership fees, making money through the many exhibitions and other, outings that they organized across the Bay Area. So this was, yes, there was an economic aspect to the social scene. I mean, it's really the economic dimension that allows for this to happen in the first place. Yeah.
They have a communal darkroom facility.
Yes, they did. They had their dark rooms in their headquarters in San Francisco for decades, really. And this is the reason why in the 1920s these aspiring photographers would go to the California Camera Club. They weren't necessarily interested in becoming a member of this quirky organization. They were more interested in the facilities that the club provided. The club had darkroom equipment. The club had a library with the latest photo magazines and literature. And the club had exhibition space where you could show your work. And there's correspondence at the Amon Carter, for example, of Laura Gilpin, who was now a famous Southwestern photographer who corresponded for years with the secretary of the California Camera Club in the early 1920s saying, I want a solo exhibit. Because San Francisco was the major photo hub of the West Coast, and it was meaningful to have your works shown there. So it's really much a springboard for later artists, and the communal aspect is so important there. Yeah. Thank you.
Please feel free to ask questions informally. And if you brought a copy of the book, Dr. Görgen is happy to sign your copy. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening. And the lecture is live streamed, so you can also return to it and listen again on the School of Visual Arts YouTube page. Thank you again.
So much.